Here we are.
Mm-hmm.
George, good afternoon. Good evening to me.
Mm-hmm.
You're in the US, I'm in Central Europe. Thank you for joining this new series, which I call War as Reset.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic was nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare. The truth is that it is still a reality for most of the world's population as we speak. Look, for example, at Hong Kong or other Chinese cities which are going again into full lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
Many wish that the Russo-Ukrainian war was nothing more than a bad dream or a nightmare. We are over a month into this war, or operation as the Russians call it. According to psychoanalysis, nightmares can only disappear when their meaning is represented. Why this new web series, which somehow follows my first web series where you were part of, and also the book Breakfast at Kuznets that came out two years ago by Chiron, and then the following one, Lockdown Therapy, which book is coming out this summer. The aim of these interviews or conversation on YouTube are very important to me for different reasons. One, because following Andrew Samuels, both the microcosm of an individual and the macrocosm of the global village were floated by psychological themes, and that politics embodies the psyche of a people. But Andrew also demonstrated how useful and effective perspective derived from psychotherapy might be in the formation of policy, in new ways of thinking about the political process, and in the resolution of conflicts. This series, I believe, is an opportunity for depth and to contrast or even compensate what I called media voyeurism.
Mm-hmm.
When we eat war, we switch on the TV, we look at the magazine, and war is treated as an attraction. Our attraction is to eat war. The BBC is now showing images from my TV, and are the same image, same news, no news every half an hour. Maybe we will also talk about Wotan, who was written in 1936 by Jung.
Mm-hmm.
And I link this media voyeurism to media bulimia. And I really hope our conversation will help to go deeper and deeper in the meaning of what war is. This war, any war, beyond war. My first question for you, because of your personal experience in the military and as an analyst, what is war?
Well, as in our previous conversations, I've thought about this a little bit since these are the kind of questions that come up. I do think that it is worth starting a conversation with what I take to be two very classic definitions of war from a defining standpoint. And then we can get into discussions of what goes beyond that. And there are two that I think capture different aspects of what we're talking about with war. One comes from Clausewitz, a great theoretician of war around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. He was a general. And of course, his classic definition, which seems very sterile in some ways, but is an important one to keep in mind, is that war is a continuation of politics by other means.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to keep that one in mind, that it's not something that simply springs spontaneously out of the world. It leads off of other factors going on. The other definition, I watched a little bit of your interview with Murray Stein, and I had to drop him a note saying, Murray, it wasn't General Marshall that said war is hell. It was General Sherman in the American Civil War. And that expression, war is hell, gets used a lot, but he actually said somewhat more than that. His actual comments, which he made several times and in different settings, was, and I have it written down here, war is at best barbarism. Its glories are moonshine. War is hell. And that's a very different from the war is a continuation of politics by other means. But both of them capture critical aspects of what it means, what war consists in. It's both a formal undertaking that nations can decide to do in pursuit of interests and political objectives that are not otherwise resolved. And once entered into, it becomes something that most people don't want to really pay attention to. You talk about the television depictions of it and so on, that I don't mean to diminish that side of things, but it's a little, it does take on some of the same qualities as what people do when they pass a serious car accident on the highway, to pause and look at it. It's a fascination with situations like that. And one of the things about that I think it's worth noting in most of the news broadcasts around, let's take the war that's going on right now. There's lots and lots of pictures that people will see of destroyed tanks that have been blown apart. Russian tanks, by and large, because of the weapons that have been given to the Ukrainians. It's worth keeping in mind that that the basic tank crew consists of 3 people. And if those tanks are hit with one of these Javelin missiles unexpectedly, whoever's inside that tank is incinerated along with it, which is the way in which wars take place. And that's where Sherman's remark becomes relevant. And that part, even in the graphic depictions that you'll see these days, which is much more so than in previous wars, frankly, you rarely get to see the full dimensions of the destruction, the human destruction that's taking place.
We moved from talking about COVID almost 24/7, being obsessed with COVID, to being obsessed with war. I'm these days, when I think of war, I think that war is the opposite than what Truman Capote said or stated, thinking of the Vanity Fair. War is the atrocity fair. But the atrocity fair is brought to us by the Vanity Fair of the TV, of the media outlets that only need to fulfill their advertisement slots. I wonder whether if the media would, and we can talk about COVID and now, if the media would decide to really inform instead of, in a bulimic way, give us information, make us ingest information and vomit to have more. I wonder whether things could be different. I'm really disturbed by having to watch 24/7 images that are every day more painful. 1 week ago, 30 soldiers were killed. 2 days ago, 80 soldiers were killed. Yesterday, there were 10 bombs. Today, there are 50 bombs. It's like an escalation in the news, which is really, really repulsive.
If you're asking whether I think that there be any, are you asking if you think that if I think there would be any change in the dimensions of the war if media were not involved in it?
No, I'm trying to ask for consideration or the reflection of the power of the medias. Not what is going on in you.
I didn't catch that.
But really on informing and allowing or not allowing depth. That's why our conversation will be long, more than 1 hour. Yeah. allowing or not allowing depth?
Well, I think that where depth is concerned, for example, in the current situation, there are, well, there's a tendency, I think, in a variety of different ways with situations like this, and perhaps also with the COVID business, although I haven't thought about that to the same degree, where people try to different framings of the circumstances tend to be very narrowly constructed in order to try to simplify things for people. And I think, for example, in the case of war and international conflict, for example, there's a major school of thought in international relations going back certainly to the 19th century that views all of these conflicts as simply contests between great powers, expression that was frequently used from the 19th century up to the present. So during the Cold War, we are trying to avoid a direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that could lead to an incomprehensible catastrophe. But in order to manage the great power conflict, we have proxy wars like Vietnam and Afghanistan. Even the Korean War was to some extent in that category, although that was a somewhat different situation. But that way of thinking about it, or frankly, I think if we try to go too far with just using psychology or psychoanalysis, again, you leave out chunks of what's actually taking place, what actually the motivations are. One of the things in the present situation that I don't see, there are articles, there are people commenting on it, but by and large, they're not getting into the larger media networks about the role of, for example, the conflict within the Orthodox Church, the global structure of the Orthodox Church between the Patriarch of Moscow, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the attempts on the part of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine to separate itself from the Patriarchate of Moscow and come under the Patriarchy of Constantinople, who recognize, and so on and so forth, and that the Patriarch of Moscow has got interests in Africa, and that there's a whole network of religious conflict that underpins much of this, of what we're seeing in Ukraine. That's completely lost in discussions, for example, from a geopolitical standpoint. And it's the dimensions of its full extent are not very well understood, even I suspect by some of the people who do more classical international relations thinking. They may be aware of it, but it doesn't factor into their thinking. And there are other aspects of this. People talk about Vladimir Putin thinking that the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the worst things that ever happened in the 20th century. Mind you, in a century that had quite a number of worse things happening. Well, yes, that seems to be another factor involved here. But there are other ideological things going on. There's an intellectual underpinning to a lot of this that that doesn't find its way into the spectacle, and frankly doesn't seem to find its way into a lot of the strategic thinking, may indeed have far more relevance to particularly a Jungian interpretation of some of this. And I can say something about that. from some of the work that I did do when I was in the military at the Pentagon. In 1978, which is a long time ago now, I was working on and off because I was back at graduate school from my time in the Air Force. So I was doing reserve duty down at the Pentagon, but I was for about 4 years. And the second 2 years, I was working in a rather an office in the Pentagon that most people have never heard of, called the Directorate of Net Assessment, a very small group of people, a sort of internal think tank. And we were working. The questions at hand were two questions came up that I was particularly working on. One was an overall issue that was being dealt with at that time about how to enhance deterrence, nuclear deterrence. But one of the questions that was still floating around was, why were the Russians intent on building such large, dirty bombs? Whereas in the United States, we were building very small, very clean bombs. And as I mentioned to you before we started the conversation, I was running this. It was in parallel with my work on Jung and writing my dissertation on Jung and Freud at Yale. And I sort of took a step back and said, well, what are the governing myths here? And I wrote 2 papers. One was on the dirty bomb question, and I said, if you look at the history of Russian warfare, particularly notable, obviously, most recently, the Napoleonic War and the Second World War, was that the Russians relied so heavily on the land, that being able to retreat from Moscow, for example, retreat further and further back. In fact, in World War II, there are stories about the Germans advancing rapidly, so rapidly into Russia as the Russian army pulled back that they ran off the edges of their maps and they didn't know where they were any longer. And so the Russians now had an advantage by simply making use of the space. So my speculation in the paper that I was writing on why they build big dirty bombs is, if your presumption is that the land is what is most important in war, what would you do? You would try to develop ways in which to prohibit the use of land. You would sow the soil with salt. On the other hand, in the West, what is the central strategic element of conflict in the West? It's the city. It's city busting. That's what we did in World War II. It's what you attack. You don't drop bombs all over England, or drop bombs all over France, or drop bombs all over Germany. You drop bombs all over Berlin or London. Because those were much more strategically important. Well, how do you do that with a nuclear weapon? You build a small, clean, a very small nuclear weapon will destroy an entire city. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were about 11 kilotons, which is by the Russians were detonating 50 megaton bombs. Well, they only did that once, but 50 megaton bomb. We're talking about bombs that are much smaller but can destroy an entire city. So you have this dichotomy between the two strategic arrangements in terms of what the sort of fundamental idea of what matters in your strategic equation, whether it's the land or it's the city. That it gives an explanation of why they were doing something different. Now, was that the reason? I really have no idea. But it was the first time, a number of people that I was working with thought it was one of the first times that we had some kind of a plausible explanation from a strategic standpoint as to why they were doing this. The other paper that I wrote was a deterrence paper where I said, working off of this first paper was, and you have to understand that in the so-called mutual assured destruction regime of the Cold War, the last thing anybody wanted to do was to start a war. So you're always looking for ways to convince the other side that not only would they be destroyed, but that you would not be destroyed. And so there was a sort of constant playing with quite sophisticated and intricate ways of signaling one another about ways to do this. And our concern at that time was that the Russians, the Soviets had been significantly improving their civil defense capabilities to the extent that we no longer could pose the kind of threats that we needed to do in order to keep this balance going. And I wrote a paper, say, again, based off of the land idea, that if you have this retreat into this vast hinterland as a way of conducting war, what would happen if you signaled that you had the capability to cut European Russia off from that vast space in the back by the use of nuclear weapons, for example. In other words, attack precisely to attack that land concept that they rely on and put that concept under threat. So when we look at what's going on right now, and we talk about, you go to Patriarch Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow, talking about the integrity of the land that extends from Russia into Ukraine and even beyond. And there's another set of thinkers there. I think it starts with, there's this fellow, Alexander Dugin, for example. I don't know if you probably...
We'll come to him in a bit.
Yeah, you've probably heard of him. But again, he wants all of Eurasia so that this extends that space out again. So this idea of that there's a relationship to the land that is fundamental to thinking about the conflict is, again, simply not really picked up in your media. It's not picked up by to the degree I think is probably required by a lot of your international relations people. And it leaves us then trying to understand a situation whose complexity considerably exceeds most of these standard ways of thinking about these things.
What is, you touch upon it, what is, according to your experience as a former military, as a lieutenant in the reserve, your work also in relation to peace, what is the ultimate meaning of this war? Let me share with you my take on it, which is psychological, but up to a certain extent. And is about land, is about fatherland, is about father. My feeling is that this war is not about Ukraine or Ukrainians wanting to join the West, Europe or the US because of the BMWs, McDonald's or Hollywood movies. But it's about join a philosophy of life or democracies being polis of democracies where the institution, the nation, is healthy or healthy enough. I will try to explain. Almost all European countries, take away Hungary, Poland, but everyone else, for sure not Turkey, for sure not Russia. I would say the US still, although the Trump years and the Trump troubles,
we can talk about that.
Are healthy democracies. Why? Because although, an attack to the fundamentals of democracy, the institution, although the tension, can survive and move on. Your example, you as a US citizen, different elections, Trump gets elected, there is a lot of tension, and there are again elections which are democratic, and someone else is elected. This is, I feel, what the Ukrainians tried to tell us or tried to do since the early 2000s. Especially in 2014 with Maidan. Yeah? And when the peaceful demonstrations were suppressed. We want to move from an authoritarian nation, state, or ingerence from the outside into a modern nation that is healthy enough, that can decide for itself. What do you think?
Well, yes, I think that, well, several things. I would completely agree with you on how Ukraine would view becoming a reasonably well-functioning democratic state. And what we do know about reasonably well-functioning democratic states, Western Europe, the United States, you're correct, is in a precarious position right now for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
We can come back to that if you want to. But here again, we really need to ask the counter question, which is, what is it about authoritarianism, not simply as the impulse of one particular dictator or a strongman or whatever you want to call them, but as a genuine theory of an appropriate way to organize a society, which is what I think, going back to the there's several other people from Russian intellectuals who influence Putin. What's his name? I wrote him because I read about these. Ivan Ilyin, for example, who was in the 1920s, I think, and I just ran into an article about Mikhail Urin, a novel called The Third Empire, which seems to be almost a textbook for what Putin is doing right now in terms of these moves. But amongst this, and Durgin is an important, very important figure in this area, it seems to me, that the authoritarian structure is in fact a superior, or the more appropriate, or the correct way to organize a society. And democracy is fundamentally corrupt and degenerate. Why is it corrupt and degenerate? Well, I mean, if you listen to a lot of what's being talked about in Russia these days, well, all of these social movements, homosexual rights, transgender rights, one thing and another, and that's one of the critical things we're dealing with in this country, in the authoritarian side of the United States, is these are the defining features of a democracy, that they allow these kinds of things to happen. And since they are fundamentally to be condemned for moral, religious, cultural reasons, then it's obvious that democracy is no longer viable. Now, I visited the Soviet Union twice in the late 1980s, before the fall, 1985 and 1986, and then I was back again, I think it's about 6 years ago now, to lecture to the analyst groups analyst group over there. I had a wonderful time. It was unbelievably different between when I went there in the late 80s. I was faculty advisor to a group of students from Yale, and we were going to spend about a week with students from Moscow State University. We were very cordial, had some wonderful time there, but it was in fact the case. I wanted to go down. We were staying sort of in central Moscow, just off of Red Square, which was all very nicely put together and so on. But I wanted to go visit a couple other places. You got off the main streets in Moscow, and the roads weren't paved. The streets weren't paved. They were dirt. And I actually went back, made the comment that what in heaven's name are we so worried about this country for? You go into the GUM department store at that point, and you couldn't find bread. When I went back, like I say, 6 years ago or so, so maybe 2015, 2000, something like that, 2012, GUM was like Disneyland of products. It was like, Prada and everything. Unbelievable change and material change. Now, I can't say this categorically, and I'd be curious what some of our Russian colleagues would think of it, but someplace along the way, it seems that for some elements in the leadership in Russia, moving down that road towards Western material abundance was somehow not properly Russian, or not the way that the world was supposed to be organized, and you were getting way too much Western decadence.
Well, let me share with you my experience. In the year 2000, I went to Budapest as Erasmus student.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I was one of the first Western European students going to Budapest. And my feeling was joining something new in development, with a huge split between culture, getting to school, getting education, or make money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And make money won, I would say, in the Eastern Bloc. But I wonder whether, so touching upon reason of this war and other wars, what is this about? You said streets were not paved, was no bread, and now there is opulence. Prada, Gucci, Armani, Ferrari, Lamborghini. It's about compensation. You know, when we think of compensation, of course, we think of World War II. Compensation of the defeat, of the humiliation. What's happening today? Is it comparable to Hitler's Germany? Is it about kairos and not chronos? And again, you touch upon the concept of land. We should talk about the concept of father or fatherland. No, Kirill.
Mm-hmm.
This war is against gay. It's about LGBTQ rights. It's about impurity. You wrote an amazing book about Jung and Freud, and they both had a difficult relationship with their father.
Mm-hmm.
They both thought their father was a hero, and the day they discovered the father was no hero, they unconsciously, this is my fantasy, needed to compensate that and become themselves heroes. And they became heroes. They invented something and they became huge personalities. So my idea is, when somebody is ashamed of his father, like Freud was,
Mm-hmm.
in that anti-Semitic event in the streets of Vienna, like Jung, his father is a pastor who has lost his faith. One day they realize their parents are no heroes, their father is no hero, so they want to become a hero to compensate the lack of their father. Is this the case with Putin? Is this the case with Russia today? Also thinking of what Jung wrote in After the Catastrophe, that the leader is always a mirror of the nation, of the collective unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I ask you this? Is Putin compensating not Lenin, who we blamed as the cause because of the autonomy of Ukraine, but actually his political father, Yeltsin, who was a drunken, who was not able to govern? How much next to the concept of land, there is the concept of the father and fatherland?
Well, I would, I think one has to be a little careful about trying to get inside his head. I think just let me just start with something fairly mundane at this point. I suspect that given what we've seen of Putin's behavior over the last 2 years, you mentioned the COVID business. He seems to have a truly paranoid fear of infection. Trump, by the way, does as well, but couldn't quite behave the way Putin has. These bizarre pictures of him sitting, 50, 60 feet away from his advisors and so on. I mean, it's bizarre. My guess in the short term, just to start there, because I have to sort of process your question a little bit before I can give a complete answer to it, is that he really isolated himself for the last 2 years with a very small group of protectors,
yeah,
and a very small group of influencers. And I mean, we can talk about the Russian army and how it operates. They're not likely to try and cross the leader very much. I mean, Trump didn't like them, but he had generals who would tell him that he didn't, that he couldn't do certain things. And George W. Bush's defense people didn't like some of the things some of the generals told them before we had the Iraq war. A couple of them got fired, but they didn't get shot, which still can happen in Russia, from what I gather. That said,
or public humiliation, like live 2 weeks ago with his chief security advisor.
Yeah, his intelligence, sort of the FSB, or part of the FSB. Point being that now the father, Yeltsin, I'm not sure that from what little I know, and I think here's where getting the details maybe can be important. From what I know, it wasn't so much Yeltsin. I don't know. I don't recall his name. I've run into it. There were a couple of other people who were promoting Putin to Yeltsin. So it's a little bit unclear to me whether Yeltsin would be a father figure that he would be reacting against. Once again, I take your point. I think it's an interesting one, certainly interesting with Jung and Freud and many others. There's been speculation about Hitler along those lines, and was his father in fact Jewish, and he was reacting. I would not want to try and validate that. It's not my field, but the thing that I've seen about Putin's background that seems to be fairly salient, and I will say it surprises me a little that he is doing what he's doing in Ukraine, was the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, he wasn't born yet, but the extent I've been in St. Pete. Well, I went to Stalingrad twice when I was there in the 1980s, and Leningrad, Battle of Leningrad. If we talk about Stalingrad, I know this had an interesting situation about Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, once upon a time. But Leningrad, I caught a little bit of your interview with Tom, where he mentions this statue of Mother Russia.
Oh.
I've been there. It's a statue that is in the middle of an immense mass grave, immense mass grave of all of the people that were killed in the siege of Leningrad. And you know, when I hear him talking about denazifying, you know, I think to a lot of people it doesn't make any sense. But if you want to motivate, particularly, certainly the older, there are very few people who are still alive who would have actually been present during World War II. It's been, you know, a long time. But if you want to have a singular motivation for Russia in some degree, it's the fight against Nazis, particularly at the siege of Leningrad, which I suspect he was raised on, because that's where he's originally from. And the you know, one of the funny things in Russia that I could see even when I was there a couple times, there remains to this day a very pronounced, very strong, almost cult of Stalin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
That hasn't gone away, and he was, you know, he was one of the most vicious, destructive human beings of the 20th century, and, along with Hitler and Mao Zedong. But he is revered by a substantial part of the population in Russia to this day.
Till now. You mentioned this statue, which is really gigantic.
It is huge.
A woman with a sword.
Mm-hmm.
Svetlana Alexievich and others underline that war is masculine.
Mm-hmm.
Is war masculine? Especially when now, not because now armies are of male and female soldiers or even transgender soldiers, like in the US. But it seems that in this war, the 4 million people that became refugees overnight are grandparents, moms, and kids, but many women decided
Mm-hmm.
to stay and fight.
Mm-hmm.
When taking into consideration what you just said about this statue, maybe even looking at mythology, you know, at era, and there is something there. Is war masculine? Would be warfare different if in charge there would be no male? I know it's a banal question, but maybe we should.
Pardon me, but I haven't listened to either the entirety of your interview with Tom or Murray, because I've been
good.
And quite frankly, I didn't want to anticipate or sound like I was repeating something they said. But I did catch, I was just sort of dropping through a little bit. You know, Murray and I are very close. Murray was my first analyst, as a matter of fact, when I first went into analysis, and we didn't work together for a long time, but we've remained very close since then. But I did happen to, for whatever reason, maybe it was synchronicity, that I dropped into that question when you asked it of Murray. And a little anecdote came to my mind. When I was in middle school and high school, it's far enough back that there were quite a few men who had been in World War II who were my teachers.
Yeah.
And they rarely talked about the war. I had one history teacher who had been in the Marines in the Pacific, but I had a teacher in 8th grade, which I mean, I'd be about 13 years old, who'd been with the OSS in Yugoslavia. The OSS was the predecessor to the CIA. And he was in Yugoslavia with the resistance forces in Yugoslavia. And he did tell us a story once that every once in a while, these little cells of resistance fighters would get together out in the woods and so on. They had to coordinate from time to time. He says they were almost all men, but once in a while, there would be the most terrifying group would come into one of these little aggregations. And the most terrifying group was a small group of women resistance fighters, and the men were scared of them because they were known for the viciousness with which they would attack the Germans. So when I saw that question come up in talking with Murray, I think one can ask the question whether it's just a masculine enterprise. I think, or if in this instance, one almost gets the feeling that the men would rather the women weren't there because they're even given the opportunity or the circumstances, they can be as aggressive and as dangerous, and if not more so than the men are. In terms of regulating it.
It's a matter of men are instinctively aggressive and women, is a generalization, and women are instinctively pondering, reflecting. You know that I like to talk to as many men as many women in my company. Mm-hmm. And as per breakfast at Kuznach, I ask many people, and man tells me, yes, let's do it. As you did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, let's do it. Alpha, we're recording. But I see that women are willing to answer my questions, but it's different. The approach is reflective in a different way. Yes, maybe in a bit or not now. So I wonder whether there is also something of this in warfare. And then we can think, for example, of recent examples of the Kurdistan freedom fighter women that were trying to fight for their country. The Vikings, for example, the Valkyrias, and so on. Last question about war before we switch to something else. Why is war turning normal person into beasts? And especially, what is your opinion on those non-Ukrainians who have enlisted and are traveling to Ukraine to fight? Are they heroes, poors, suicidal, hopeful Davids against Goliath?
Well, I think we can pick up on your earlier question. I was using an anecdote as a sort of counter one example, this teacher that I had had. One of the things about the military, and let's talk a little bit, not just about war, but about military, the organization of military forces. People who've never been around it sometimes will talk about, well, why so much marching and giving orders and one thing and another and so on and so forth. What's important to keep in mind is that military operations can get out of control very, very quickly and become nothing but destruction. I think that both men and women, but certainly with men, let's leave it at that for now, relation to your previous question. One of the reasons for the way in which militaries organize themselves and the discipline that is imposed on people and the regulation that's imposed on people, and the wearing of uniforms and so on and so forth, is to restrain violence and direct it. And that's something that's lost on people who've never been around war or around the military very much. Absent that, you get a different kind of violence.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned Sherman, General Sherman at the beginning. General Sherman was, even though he says war is barbarity, it cannot be refined. In Sherman's march to the sea, he cut through Georgia, and he cut through the South, devastating, destroyed the city of Atlanta, but first told the people in the city, you have to evacuate the city. I will help you evacuate the city. I will take care of you once you've evacuated the city, but I'm going to destroy Atlanta because it's a railroad center and it's a manufacturing center supporting the Confederacy. But he executed any soldiers that pillaged. So he had a policy of destruction that's several miles wide. He basically just mowed through the South to the sea. But anyone who randomly started to pillage or rape or anything else were going to be held to account. So the policy was one way, total destruction, but that it had to be managed in a particular way. It couldn't be random destruction. It couldn't be individuals just acting outside of that space. So it's a paradoxical situation where genuine military operations are undergoing. Now, one of the problems with the Russian military has always been that and this is one of the things that Putin has not calculated. I mean, the reason that they are losing so badly, at least on the battlefield, leaving aside the cities, is that they thought that things would operate the way they had in the past, where sheer mass overwhelms the enemy. The thing that has not been calculated, as far as I can see, by Putin the biggest mistake that Putin's probably made in this whole thing is that he helped create and relied upon this kleptocratic society. Mm-hmm. That is so corrupt that tires are rotting on their vehicles. There's a lot of articles now showing up in some places. The way that the corruption worked, if an order went in for 100 bombs, the Air Force would get 5, and whoever the oligarch was that had gotten gets the money for the other 95. So quite frankly, as a sort of irony in the background of this, it seems to me that Putin has created a system within the oligarchy that has probably done more than anything else to undermine his ability to execute the war successfully. But now those are just some thoughts, I suppose. I'm kind of losing my track of thought.
Let me help you back. What do you think about these non-Ukrainians who have enlisted in trials?
Non-Ukrainians. Well, I tell you what.
Suicidals, Davids against Goliath.
Well, one thing about
idiots. We could also say idiots.
There's a movie I would recommend. It's very, very good. And frankly, it illustrates this subject. You may have seen it. It's called The Hurt Locker.
No, I haven't.
It's about explosive ordnance disposal team in Iraq. And my first 2 years in the Air Force, I worked very closely with the explosive ordnance disposal people because I was responsible for trying to deal with serious weapons accidents. They are constantly on an adrenaline rush.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, one of the problems I think we have in the United States with a lot of our veterans right now is because we have conducted a war that went on for 20 years. And a lot of these men, since it's a voluntary force, were back and going through cycle after cycle after cycle of this very high tension environment. If you're in, particularly if you're in combat, you're on an adrenaline high all the time. And what you'll see in the Hurt Locker, I won't go into all the details, but there's the main character there comes back from a period in Iraq from disarming bombs. And he's with his wife and his kid in the grocery store and so on. And he simply can't take it. He goes back.
Yeah.
It's going back into that environment. Now, I think that's probably some people are, have a genuine commitment to the idea of the Ukrainians, but I would suspect that some of them are looking for a return to that adrenaline high.
Yeah. Junk is for adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting view. Thank you. Let's stay on Putin, or let's go back on Putin, because when this started, as it happened with Trump or maybe Boris Johnson, all the bad guys, TVs, medias try to psychopathologize the bad guy. We also commented that he's obsessive or he's paranoid. Is it useful to psychopathologize him? Because frankly, and I was reading about this the other day, I don't remember who said it, but I was thinking of this last week. He's a cold-blooded killer. He doesn't seems to be so mad. It seems he's very clear in what he's doing. He has a desire. He has the desire to bring together people of the same origin, maybe even to bring back the Soviet Union. He's accusing Ukraine of genocide, but actually he's doing genocide. Look at Mariupol, Kharkiv. So There's been a projection. What do you think? Is it appropriate to psychopathologize someone like him, someone like Trump? And if so, why?
Well, I do think that we can say quite a bit about Trump. Several of our colleagues, in fact, Tom Singer was one of them. There's a group of Jungians that wrote a book on collection of essays. There was a psychiatrist at Yale who got a collection of essays together on Trump, as a malignant narcissistic personality disorder. And I think there's every reason to believe that that's a pretty accurate diagnosis for him. And the fact of the matter is, and probably, if I would probably get a bunch of hate mail from some young Trumpians if they listen to the thing, but he's a coward and a bully. And if you'll pardon me for saying so, he's a draft dodger, because I go back to that same, I'm the same generation. I think he's got a year on me or something from the Vietnam period. And Putin doesn't strike me as a coward or a bully in that sense of the word, as somebody who tries to compensate for some inadequacy by pushing people around and so on. And he is, to use your expression, far more cold-blooded about it. There is some speculation right now, and it's just speculation, that there's something wrong with him now, physically. So, that maybe. I do happen to think that he may have been counting more on the possibility of Trump's reelection in which case he would have had almost an open door to Europe, because it's very likely that Trump would have pulled the United States out of NATO. And you can say what you want to about NATO, but it worked for a long time, and President Biden has made it should stick it back together again, at least for the time being. So there may be a calculus there that he thought. Quite frankly, I think one of the things we're dealing with is that a couple of the personalities on Fox News in particular are basically just repeating Putin's line endlessly, and in fact are being broadcast in Russia to demonstrate that there's this American faction within the United States that is sympathetic to Putin and to the invasion. I have this suspicion that it's reciprocal, that Putin's been watching too much Fox News. And so of course, what's the line of Fox News on Joe Biden? Well, he's senile. He can barely make it to the desk in the morning. Doesn't know what he's doing. That Fox News has been pumping that all the way through the election and through his presidency. Biden's getting old, but he sure isn't losing his touch, it seems to me. I mean, he may walk a little slower. I walk a little slower. I'm 5 years younger than he is. But he's doing. But if you are listening to certain elements of the American press, you're going to come away with the idea that this will be a pushover.
Mm. Obama.
I don't know if that helps answer your question, your more psychoanalytic question, but I would say in terms of pathologizing Putin, I think it's a little bit tricky. He wasn't a real high-level KGB operative most of his career. He was in a sort of backwater in East Germany for quite a while. He's a little bit elevated. His background is a little bit elevated in some of the commentaries, as if he was this sort of master spy, and he really wasn't for most of his career.
Yeah. When Obama became president in 2008, he proposed a symbolic reset to Putin. There is a gag or a televised moment between former Secretary of State and Exterior Minister Lavrov.
Yes.
Clinton and Lavrov, where she's handing him this reset button. Thanks God it's not a nuclear. They hoped for a reset. It didn't work.
It didn't work. No.
Is war reset? Is it the great reset? What do you think? You have experience. You are one of the few Jungians who have military background, not only a psychological, psychoanalytical background. I remember my mom or my grandma saying this, somehow war is needed to reset, or if there was a war, you would. Obviously, this is common parlance, but could be seen war as the total reset.
I have a couple of reactions to that. And I don't want to exactly sound like there's an automatic cycle in foreign policy, but if you do look over a period, quite a long period of time, you'll see a major conflict, a war of some sort, and then you will have roughly a 75-year period where you'll have a war. You'll have the Treaty of Westphalia, or you'll have the Treaty of Versailles. Now, that's a little bit. Yeah. The First World War and I'm of the opinion, I'm of that school that sees the First World War and the Second World War as one war.
Yeah.
Hiatus. One massive, prolonged conflict over a long period of time. But you get you get to 1940, well, Barbara Tuchman's book on the Guns of August, for example, you get to this 1911 funeral of the King of England, or it was Edward VII, I think, but don't hold me to that. I can never remember for sure. And you have all of these cousins, William of Germany and the Tsar and a whole bunch of other minor ones. They're all related to one another. They're the crowns of all of Europe. They get together, and like Barbara Tuchman says, it's the last time they'll ever be together. And this entire regime that's existed from, well, in some degree from the Middle Ages, collapses.
Yeah.
And it takes, then you have this prolonged conflict. And then you get the end of World War II, and you get the establishment of a new regime, a new international regime, United Nations, and so on. We're now 75 years on, roughly. And no one from that period is alive anymore, or the ones that are alive are gone. And it's almost as if you have when you talk about a reset, it is a way of thinking about it, that a reset then will be generated in order to establish some new regime going forward for a period of time. Now, the problem right now, and I think we haven't talked about this, but I do think that you talk about the COVID, we haven't talked at all about climate change. We haven't talked about a couple of other factors involved. There is a degree to which I think we have an unusual confluence of crises coming at the world. And the intersection between these things, I talked earlier on about how we are ignoring the religious aspect of this war, where we have a serious parallel process in the United States with right-wing evangelical Christians. I've said in a couple of occasions, one of the things that I think in Jung is very interesting that we really need to pay attention to. You mentioned my book. I think I used the expression in the book at one point there, Jung's theory of the life cycle of a symbol. He talks about symbols when they first emerge historically. Because they're connecting the conscious with the unconscious, they carry this great numinous quality to them. But over time, they become exhausted. They become the interpretation, the work on the symbol that takes place over time eventually reduces them to a sign, to use his distinction between Freud and Freud's ideas and his own ideas. And, you can have different time scales here. When I talk about the 75-year time scale in international relations, you can sort of see that working itself out historically. Something along, so you have a reset in that degree. Jung talked about, and people get all very excited all the way back to the 60s about the age of Aquarius and this change and so on. And the astrology folks in the Jungian community are out there talking about the new gods, or you get one thing and another. The fact of the matter is, in my opinion, that the Christian era, in some way, the symbolism is exhausting itself.
Yeah.
And in consequence, you're getting these increasingly radical attempts to hold on to the symbolism. To my mind, it's a little bit like what probably happened in late Hellenistic antiquity when the ancient pagan system was collapsing, because people just couldn't take it seriously anymore. And then you get a new set of symbolism coming in with Christianity and so on. So it does seem to me, where reset is concerned, it's a little bit a question of, well, what time scale are we talking about resetting? And we may be at an odd place where the reset is taking place at several different time scales. And the Ukrainian war is part of that, because it does have this apocalyptic view, almost, or messianic view, coming out of some of these intellectuals in Russia, that we need to expand in this way. There's a curious, I understand it at one level, it comes out of Heidegger, as a matter of fact, curious view of America that Heidegger disliked, talks about it as gigantism in the interview that he did with Der Spiegel, the last interview that he did with Der Spiegel. It shows up in other places that this needs to be resisted. It has this sort of metaphysical, spiritual quality to it, and that's, see, we can go on about this, but there's this confluence of a variety of different time scales and different crises that are all impinging on one another. The COVID thing is, we may get this particular one under control, but I'm fairly certain that we're beginning to see what will probably be a cyclical process of
from pandemic to a pandemic.
One pandemic to another, not least because some of that's tied up with climate change, which we're absolutely simply not getting any control over at all, as far as I can see.
And is out of the agenda, is out of the media.
Mm-hmm.
What you just said is very interesting. When a symbol loses its meaning and becomes a sign, linking to what Kirill is saying, linking this is also a religious war, and there's been many religious wars in the past 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether the reset, from a symbol to sign and back from sign to symbol, is also a development from a war of religion for the dogma into what we Jungian know very well, which is the development of spirituality, which is not per se religious.
Well, I would, before we talk about that, I would point out there are many religious wars. You're correct about that, and they increasingly have this fundamentalist quality to them. I mean, you look at India, for example, what's happening there with the fundamentalist Hinduism, and there's a relatively rarely noticed but very powerful right wing in Japan that's very tied to the old emperor ideology. It's almost a fundamentalist Shinto tradition, and so on. So it's a kind of a global thing, or approaching a global phenomenon, and that raises some very curious questions about what we're dealing with globally. Spirituality. My daughter, Catherine, she took some time off after high school, but she's now a freshman in college and doing a double major in religious studies and environmental studies. And because her project is essentially to find, to try to see if there's some way to connect the environmental issue up to, she's very interested in indigenous spiritual traditions and whether that has some traction here and so on. And I think there's things like that are a possibility. But spirituality, I mean, my original field was Buddhist studies, very long time ago.
I remember.
I studied in Japan with Masao Abe and others there as an undergraduate. I think that one has to be a little bit thoughtful about a sort of just undifferentiated spirituality, without any, again, it too easily becomes something that is just while I'm a thinking function person, it gets to be a little bit too easily just an emotive state that doesn't give you traction. You have to have some way of distinguishing things. I gave a keynote to the folks that work with Gigerich. I know you made a presentation there too. I confess I wasn't entirely happy with it. Gigerich, I'm very interested in him, but it's difficult. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around him in some ways. But I made the remark there that I had difficulty with James Hillman's idea of this, of this sort of daimon, this sort of guiding principle. It's because I got in an argument with him once about how this even goes back to Putin. How do we know that Putin isn't just following his daimon? How do we make ethical judgments without some sense of more than just the sort of romanticized spirituality, and I do think that's an area where Jungians need to be a little careful, a little thoughtful when invoking things like the self or soul or the personal daimon and so on. It's theologically it gets you into the question of theodicy. Well, how do you justify horrible things happening if there's this sort of superordinate guiding force in the world and so on?
George, we are 1 hour and 20 minutes since we started.
We are, indeed.
I have so many questions to ask you. How about if we pause here and maybe in a couple of days, couple of weeks, we continue also looking at the development on the ground, but I have questions for you about actually the US and what the US did in the past 50, 60 years. I want to go to Hillman and look at his concept of war, but also to offer a mea culpa, because I run a series of interviews about COVID, and I hope COVID would be about deceleration, inner outer balance, but it seems things are not going that well. What about pausing here? Because it's been so rich, and maybe in a couple of days and couple of weeks, I continue to ask.
Probably not this week. It might be a couple of weeks. I'm going to have a very minor surgery on my hand, and I'm going to be a little bit discombobulated, I think, for a few days. But we will be in touch. I'd be happy to. You talk about Hillman. We should all, since I've just brought up Gigerich, one of the first thing that I ever read by Gigerich were a couple of his essays on nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Which I was enormously impressed with, because I was in the thick of it at that point. I was at the MacArthur Foundation working on international security policy when I read those in the late 80s. And you're talking about masculine or feminine. And if I don't know when you'll ask if you've read those essays, but if you go back to them, you'll see him talking about the nuclear weapon as having taken over the position of mater, the material, the mother.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought, this is finally something interesting to read on the subject. So yes, I'd be happy, and we can talk about complexities in this country if you want to. I'd be happy to be in touch. I think a pause right now would be probably a good idea.
I think so. Thank you, George.
My pleasure. It's always good talking with you.
Surgery.
You take care.